Now friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. Today I want to talk to you guys about one of the greatest rivalries in Star Wars history. And no, I'm not talking about the Jedi and Sith or even the Empire versus the Rebellion. I'm talking about the epic battle for starship manufacturing supremacy fought between two great companies, Incom Corporation and Sienar Fleet Systems. Now, this was not only a rivalry born out of market competition like Pepsi versus Coca-Cola or the clashing of large egos of great men like Ford versus Ferrari. There was no 24 hours at Le Mans in this competition. This battle instead represented a much larger conflict for the soul of an entire galaxy being fought between the Rebel Alliance and the Galactic Empire. This competition between Starfighter manufacturers pitted two competing ideologies in both design and style against each other in the purest and rawest test of supremacy, the dogfight. First, we have the famed Incom Corporation. Born out of humble beginnings, Incom was originally known as Torianics Inertial Compensator Corporation. The inertial compensator was a boring but extremely important piece of technology that made even the most basic maneuvers in a starfighter possible. This device used anti-gravity technology to extend a bubble around the ship to protect it from massive acceleration and maneuvers that one might do in a starfighter. It also prevented the pilots inside from blacking out or just getting crushed into goo during even the most basic maneuvers. The average human in a flight suit can withstand 9 Gs before passing out. Taking those numbers into consideration, something as slow and massive like the Executor-class Star Dreadnought was still capable of accelerating with a force of 1,000 Gs. There is no flight suit or armor in the universe that could protect you from that kind of force. So inertial compensators are among the most important components that you can find within a starfighter. They needed to be durable and also very reliable. Mastering the technology behind an inertial compensator meant that Torianics was ready to move on to other products that also depended on anti-gravity generation. So Torianics Inertial Compensator Corporation, that's a mouthful, rebranded itself as Incom Corporation and started focusing on building repulsor lifts. Repulsor lifts were one of the most common engine types in the galaxy. They used anti-gravity technology to levitate objects. As long as this engine was close to a large mass or a planet, these lifts could lift a massive amount of weight with very little effort and energy. Most in-atmospheric crafts used repulsors, so it was a massive market, but Incom quickly found out that it was also a very crowded and competitive industry. So they decided to focus on a very demanding niche market and started producing high-performance repulsor lifts used only for large stations. These repulsor lifts not only had to be extremely powerful, they also had to be very reliable because they were oftentimes holding up entire cities. Around 400 BBY, Incom landed a very high-profile project when they were hired to design the repulsor lifts that would keep Bespin Cloud City in the upper atmosphere. Now that Incom was building these amazing repulsor lifts for giant stations, the next logical step for them was to step down and start building repulsors for civilian and military application. And so in the next few hundred years leading up to the Clone Wars, Incom began establishing itself as one of the premier starfighter designers in the galaxy. Now the Republic had been at peace for almost a millennia. This is why the Galactic Republic had no federal navy and instead relied on a peacekeeping force known as the Judicials. This of course didn't mean that there wasn't unrest and small regional conflicts, especially in the lawless Outer Rim regions. Most planets in those areas had to rely on their own government to create a local or planetary defense force. Maintaining a fleet of capital ships was only a luxury that some of the largest and richest planets could afford to do in the Inner Rim, and so most of these Outer Rim planets relied on starfighters to protect their sovereignty. Incom would begin a joint starfighter project with Subpro Corporations. Subpro Corporation was a Trandoshan outfit, which meant they brought along with them a wide range of negative stereotypes. But strangely enough, Subpro Corporation was full of extremely competent engineers, and despite being considered a second-tier manufacturer, designed excellent quality ships at a bargain price. Incom combined their own very reliable engine technology with Subpro's knowledge and experience in building airframes, and this led to the Z95 Headhunter. The Z95 was a thing of beauty. It had extremely simple lines, but at the same time was extremely aggressive looking and intimidating. It's exactly what you would imagine a starfighter should look like. Incom always had this uncanny ability of designing ships that just looked perfect. And everything they built after the Z95 was modeled after it aesthetically, featuring large rocket-like thrusters and a long beak nose in the front to house sensors. The Z95 started out as a very versatile but short-range fighter. It featured 4 of Incom's 2A fission engines that were arranged around the cockpit. This would be a very popular Incom-style design for future vessels. It was equipped with a decent shield generator mounted directly behind the cockpit, and it was armed with ion cannons, wingtip laser cannons, and a pair of Krupp's MG5 concussion missile launchers. By the time the Clone Wars had started, the Z95 platform was already considered outdated by most industry experts. A lot of people didn't like the extended wings on the Z95, for instance. They created drag, which used to be essential for atmospheric vehicles, but after the invention of the repulsor lifts, starfighters didn't really need to be aerodynamically designed anymore. This needlessly increased the profile of the Z95 and made it a lot larger than competing droid fighters usually used by corporations. The ship also wasn't hyperspace ring compatible, which meant that it heavily depended on carriers for hyperspace transportation. Despite all this, with the breakout of the Clone Wars, the Z95 was placed on a short list of starfighters for the Republic to acquire because of its durability and flight characteristics. But ultimately, what limited the deployment of the Z95 when compared to ships like the V-19 Torrent Starfighter was its size. The Republic Navy was built around the Venator-class Star Destroyer, a capital ship with a uniquely designed starfighter hangar that ran down almost the entirety of its body. The Venator class heavily depended on its starfighters to protect it from enemy ships, and the V-19 Torrent, with its folding wings, was far more compact than the much larger Z95. The Republic still ordered a special clone variant of the Z95, which replaced the 4 2A Incom fission engines with 2 larger engines. Also, instead of just carrying concussion missiles, the Z95 clone version now carried proton torpedoes, significantly increasing its anti-capital ship abilities. With the breakout of the war, Incom and Subpro also started specifically designing a new starfighter for the Republic. This was known as the Aggressive Reconnaissance 170, otherwise known as the ARC 170. Now, while the term aggressive reconnaissance seems like an oxymoron or a self-defeating design, it actually perfectly fit what the Republic needed in the earlier days of the war. Lacking a true naval force with an adequate amount of capital ships, the GAR was limited to using starfighters, assault transports, and judicial corvettes in the early battles of the Clone Wars. Not only were they completely outgunned by the Separatist Navy, they were also completely outnumbered. During these confusing first days of the Clone Wars, dozens of planets were falling to the Confederacy each day, and the GAR lacked the resources to confirm which systems had fallen, let alone gather enough ships to retake them. The idea behind an aggressive reconnaissance platform was to design a ship that could be self-sufficient for quite a long period of time and, more importantly, travel through hyperspace independently. The resulting ARC 170 was a heavy-duty starfighter. It featured a 3-man crew, a pilot gunner, and a co-pilot for longer missions, along with an astromech. The gunner would man a rear turret armed with a double laser cannon. The ship also featured a proton torpedo launcher, along with 2 wingtip medium laser cannons, which meant that it could do a massive amount of damage against larger shielded ships. It's also one of the first Republic ships to feature a hyperdrive, and it was rated at an impressive Class 1.5. The ARC 170 was terrific at its main job, which usually meant jumping into potentially dangerous systems, scouting them out, and then trying to survive the journey back home. But it actually fared poorly in your standard chaotic dogfight, which were actually quite common during the Clone Wars. The ARC 170 was just too overdesigned and engineered, which meant that it was way too slow and heavy when compared to the much smaller and lighter droid fighters being fielded by the Confederacy. And while the ARC 170's massive wingtip laser cannons could take out any snub fighter with one shot, it cycled way too slowly to allow it to be effective in a dogfight. During the Battle of Coruscant, the ARC 170 suffered massive casualties compared to the much smaller and cheaper single-seat fighters being deployed by the GAR. The lessons learned from the Battle of Coruscant would completely shake up Republic starfighter doctrine. For the rest of the war, the Republic Navy would focus its resources on purchasing smaller single-pilot fighters rather than the larger ARC 170s. During the Clone Wars, Republic Sienar Systems was one of the premier manufacturers of dropships and transport vessels. It also produced engines along with small arms. The company was founded by Sienar family thousands of years before the Clone Wars, and like many family-run legacy companies, it was inflexible and weighed down by tradition. As a result, Republic Sienar Systems was one of many corporations that failed towards the end of the Clone Wars and was purchased at a very cheap price by the intergalactic banking clan, which itself had fallen under the control and influence of Supreme Chancellor Palpatine. This was no coincidence, of course, and all a part of Palpatine's plan to seize control of the galaxy's military-industrial complex in preparation for creating his new Imperial military. Republic Sienar Systems would eventually be restructured into Sienar Fleet Systems, and Wraith Sienar, the Sienar family, would eventually take over all operations. Wraith Sienar happened to be a very close friend to Wilhuff Tarkin and also Chancellor Palpatine. Wraith was a no-nonsense ship designer and engineer who focused on the production side of the business rather than marketing and branding. Building on lessons learned during the Clone Wars, Wraith Sienar was tasked with building a versatile fighter that could replace the dozens of different fighters being utilized by the Republic during the war. During the Clone Wars, Sienar had personally focused on designing luxury yachts and prototype military ships for wealthy clients. He would take inspiration from one of those ships known as the Scimitar, a stealth yacht he had built for Darth Maul, which featured 2 large vertical wings. This would eventually evolve into the prototype for the TIE Fighter line. What made the TIE Fighter so special was its ion engine. At the time, it was considered one of the most precisely manufactured propulsion systems in the galaxy. It had almost no moving parts and required very little maintenance. The TIE Fighter also lacked shields, a hyperdrive, and life support system along with heavier weapons, but this was all a part of Palpatine's grand strategy. At the time, there were 2 main prevailing schools of thought when it came to Starfighter doctrine. The first strategy involved designing your fleet around capital ships and carriers. The idea was to put all of your research and funds on fielding the best ships of the line that you could possibly make, meaning the latest shields, weapons, systems, and maximum armor and size. In this school of thought, Starfighters were seen almost as an auxiliary force, one of the many weapons on board of a battleship. Starfighters were usually reserved for short-range interception and patrolling. This, of course, was the route the Empire was going to take. The Tarkin Doctrine further made it necessary to inspire fear in the masses in order to assure stability, something that a massive ship did far better than a Starfighter ever would. On top of that, the simplicity of the TIE Fighter made it much harder for the Imperial pilots to defect and escape their posts. The second Starfighter strategy involved designing your fleet around more complex and capable Starfighters that are able to carry out a wide range of combat missions without any support from larger ships. Capital ships in this fleet are not designed for short-range exchanges of fire with other ships. Instead, they rely on good intel and early detection so that they can preemptively launch their starfighters to screen them from other enemy capital ships. Incom throughout the Clone Wars seemed to heavily invest in this second strategy despite losing a considerable amount of their market share after the Battle of Coruscant. Like Republic Sienar Systems, it would encounter financial problems with the end of the Clone Wars and would eventually be nationalized by the Galactic Empire around 1 BBY. By that time, Incom had developed a very independently minded work culture, and a large percentage of the design and engineering staff defected secretly to aid the growing Rebel Alliance. The Empire tried their best to round up all of these former Incom staff members, but they were too late to stop them from donating the prototype T65 XWing platform to the Rebellion. The T65 XWing was a balance between the Z95's overly simple design and the ARC 170's overly complicated design. This single-seated fighter was well protected with shielding and armor, and also equipped with a hyperdrive, but light and nimble enough to dogfight against the much smaller TIE Fighter. A focus on protecting the pilot was important for the fledgling Rebellion, which hardly had enough pilots to keep full fighter wings in operation. The T65 was also quite simple to fly, and its control surfaces were partly modeled after their civilian atmospheric vehicle, the T-16 Skyhopper. This was actually a common ship for rural pilots in the outer rim of the galaxy, which also happened to be one of the primary recruiting areas for the Rebel Alliance in the earlier days of the war. The T-65 also retained the ARC 170's ability to quickly jump into hostile systems, deliver a payload of weapons, and then escape to safety. This would be one of the primary attack styles for the Rebellion until after their victory at Endor. All other fighters in the Rebel arsenal were also capable of a similar fleet, as the Rebel Alliance lacked larger carriers and capital ships. Head-to-head, the Incom T65 XWing dominated the field against the Sienar TIE Fighter line. Although Imperial pilots were usually better trained and better supported, the lack of shielding on the TIE Fighter proved to be a huge problem. The X-Wing would play a key part in many early Rebel victories, and the Empire was way too slow to react to the disadvantages that the TIE Fighter had against the X-Wing. Sienar would eventually release the TIE Interceptor in an attempt to even the playing field, but it wasn't until Grand Admiral Thrawn personally designed the TIE Defender that the Empire truly had an answer to the X-Wing. But the TIE Fighter program was ultimately too expensive and competed against the Death Star for funding. The Empire ended up never building enough defenders to turn the tide of the war. So that's the story of Incom versus Sienar, and it's one of the background stories that you might not have heard of, but it's actually quite important to the outcome of the overall galactic civil war. It's also interesting how much these companies kind of reflected the ideologies of the governments or factions they were representing. Anyway, let me know what you think about this battle between these two companies in the comment section below. Do you want to see more coverage on the various corporations in the Star Wars universe? Let me know. Also, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.